Good afternoon and good morning, folks in Asia. I'm Gyuk Shin, Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. It has been more than one full year since we began working remotely, and sincerely hope that you are doing well despite all the challenges both at home and abroad. So this is a second in our webinar series on the theme of the United States in the Biden era, views from Asia. So this quarter, we are discussing how Asian countries perceive the United States under President Biden and what they expect regarding American politics and policy, from economic recovery from the pandemic to ongoing conflict with China to restoration of multilateralism, and what these perceptions and expectation can mean for US-Asian relations. So today our focus is on Southeast Asia. I am delighted to introduce my colleague, Professor Dan Emerson, who's directing our Southeast Asia program. So he will be moderating the panel after introducing the speakers. So once again, I'd like to welcome all of you to our seminar today and hope you enjoy our presentation and discussions. So now without further ado, let me turn to Dan Emerson. Dan.
Thank you very much, Giwok. And thank you to all of the listeners and watchers who have registered and are attending this event. Joe Biden's presidency began exactly merely 3 months ago today. But it is not too early to ask what Southeast Asians think of the Trump to Biden transition and the recent and likely future behavior of the new administration, including in relation to our increasingly multipolar world, the status and prospects of Southeast Asian states, and the trajectories of other countries, notably China. Our speakers today are supremely enabled talent and location in Southeast Asia to address this topic. Both are well-traveled, widely published, and highly regarded. Hoang Thi Ha is fellow and lead researcher on political security affairs at the ASEAN Studies Center of the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, where she works on political security issues in Southeast Asia, including the relations between ASEAN's member states and outside powers, such as China and America. Before joining the Institute, she held ASEAN-related positions inside Vietnam's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the ASEAN Secretariat. Also relevant to our meeting today is the role she has played in the Institute's annual survey of how Southeast Asian elites view foreign affairs, including their opinions of the United States in that context. Joseph Chinyong Liow, whom I have known and admired for many years and whose prolific writing I have enjoyed and learned from, is Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University, also in Singapore, where he holds the Tan Kah Kee Chair in Comparative and International Politics and is simultaneously a research advisor and former dean at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Also relevant to our webinar is his experience in the United States, having held the inaugural Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asian Studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and having testified on foreign policy matters before the US Congress. I might add that Singapore, located as it is at the heart of Southeast Asia, is a uniquely advantaged place from which to view and interpret the region. Ha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Emerson, for having me here at this webinar. In my presentation today, I wish to share with you a number of key findings from our latest survey with regard to Southeast Asian views of the US, as well as their anticipation towards the Biden administration going forward. The State of Southeast Asia survey has been conducted annually since 2019 by our ASEAN Studies Center at the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute based in Singapore. More than 1,000 respondents from the region's governments, research institutions, businesses, civil society, and media have participated in each edition of the survey. However, since we rely largely on the network of our professional contacts, the survey is more targeted at the foreign policy security establishment rather than the business commercial sector. And in terms of the timing, the survey was conducted from mid-November last year to the first week of January this year. That was after Mr. Biden, short of the Congress confirmation, had won the US presidential election. But it was before the shocking insurrection at the Capitol that shook the city on a hill at its core. I believe that this window of time must have injected some sense of anticipation and optimism among Southeast Asians about the incoming administration, as reflected in the improved trust ratings of the US across the survey. And I wish to highlight a number of aspects that relate to the Southeast Asian views of the US in the survey. In terms of regional influence, China continues to be seen as the most influential economic power in the region, far ahead of the US, which trails only at 7.4% compared to 76.3% of China. And the US also trails behind China in terms of political strategic influence, even though the gap is considerably smaller at 30.4% versus 49.1% of China. And it should be noted that this perception of China's predominant influence in the region has remained steadily over the last 3 years when we conduct our annual survey. Another persistent trend line is that China is considered the most influential, but it is also the most distrusted power in the region. 72.3% of the respondents were worried about China's growing economic influence in their country, while 88.6% share the same view with regard to its political strategic influence. And conversely, American influence is much better received, with 75% and 63.1% of the respondents welcoming its economic and political strategic influence respectively. And the most pronounced support for the US strategic heft comes from Vietnam, Singapore, and the Philippines. As mentioned earlier, we believe that there was the Biden effect in the uptick of the trust and confidence in the US in the 2021 survey. In 2020, we asked the respondents whether their confidence in Washington as a strategic partner and regional security provider will improve if there is a change in US leadership, and 60.3% said yes. And this year's survey results verify just that. The share of respondents having confidence in the US as a strategic partner and regional security provider increased from 34.9% last year to 55.4% this year. That was a very big jump. And there is also a lot of enthusiasm and anticipation that the Biden administration will elevate American engagement with the region. This year, 68.6% expected US engagement in Southeast Asia to increase under Biden. And that is a sharp contrast to 77% last year, who thought that US engagement in the region had decreased significantly or decreased under Trump. The US also made a surprising turnaround with an 18.1% jump in its trust rating from 30.3% in 2020 to 48.4% in 2021. This trust rating is measured by the percentage of respondents who are confident or very confident that Washington will do the right thing to contribute to global peace, security, prosperity, and governance. Washington also joins the EU as the two major powers in which Southeast Asians have the strongest confidence to provide leadership in championing the global free trade agenda. The US vote share increased significantly from 14.5% last year to 22.5%. And this is despite the trade war, despite the Trump administration's assault on the WTO, and despite the fact that the US remains outside of the two big free trade agreements in Asia Pacific, namely the RCEP and the CPTPP. And likewise, US leadership in maintaining the rules-based order and upholding international law is even more highly regarded, trailing behind only the EU. In terms of soft power, the US remains the region's top choice of tertiary education. American universities remain the most attractive to young Southeast Asians and their parents. And last but not least, since the 2020 edition of the survey, we have, quote unquote, forced our respondents to make a binary choice between the US and China when push comes to shove. And again, the US did very well this year. 61.5% of the respondents chose Washington, up from 53.6% last year, whereas the number of people who chose China has gone down significantly. The binary choice question provides a good backdrop for me to make a caveat that despite all these numbers, there is indeed no single Southeast Asian choice to be made between the US and China. Country-level data differences underline the diversity of opinions and strategic leanings across regional states. And throughout this survey, we are as impressed by the consistent trend lines in Southeast Asian perceptions on certain issues as by the nuance and texture across the region as we dive into individual countries' perspectives. The slide here is a snapshot of that diversity among regional states in their perceptions of the US, with Vietnam and Cambodia on the two ends of the spectrum, one very pro-US and one very pro-China, and Indonesia somewhere in the middle. The huge popularity of the US in Vietnam bucks the global trend in that it reached a record high during the Trump administration, and the Vietnamese were also the outlier in strongly supporting the Trump presidency, largely because they saw Trump as a tough guy who stand up to China, especially on the South China Sea issue. There is also the gap between perceptions and policies, of course. For example, despite a high level of trust in the US among the Vietnamese public and even foreign policy elite, and an ever closer security relationship between Washington and Hanoi, I don't think Vietnam will become a US ally, because Hanoi must be very sensitive to Beijing due to its geographical proximity, its economic dependency vis-a-vis China, plus the political affinity between the two communist parties, on top of the fear of abandonment by powers further afield, including the US during the Cold War. And furthermore, Vietnam's collective leadership system also ensures that internal check and balance against external bandwagoning with any single power. And last but not least, there is the gap between perceptions and realities. This, I wish to highlight that even though US soft power and international standing have suffered immensely under Trump, not everything in the Trump administration's engagement with Southeast Asia in the past 4 years was deleterious. For all the disruption, incoherence, and uncertainty in its foreign policy, the Trump administration is quietly appreciated by the ruling governments of some regional states, especially in the following dimensions. First of all, it is the Trump administration clear-eyed, critical, and competitive approach towards China, and it is a really a paradigm shift. Certainly, this has caused a lot of anxiety among Southeast Asian states about the pressure to take sides or the risk of entrapment in US-China rivalry. But part of this standing up to China is very much welcome in countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, especially with regard to Beijing's actions and claims in the South China Sea. And second, Trump's insouciance towards democracy, human rights issues, and his values-blind approach gave some breathing space to the authoritarian-leaning and or democratic backsliding countries in the region, such as Thailand and the Philippines. This also had to restore or sustain the security links between the US and these countries' military establishments. And third, Biden came to the office with the slogan, American is back, and it's true in many senses. But the reality is that the US on its own has never left Southeast Asia, especially in security strategic terms. For example, it has increased its military presence in the regional maritime domain. It has renewed its defense agreement with Singapore, or it has enhanced military defense cooperation with other regional states. And in terms of economic exchanges, despite the US withdrawal from the TPP, it remains one of the biggest trading partner of ASEAN countries, and the trade volume has increased steadily during the 4 years of the Trump administration. Intriguingly, the trade war, for all of its complicated effects, has indeed accelerated the relocation of parts of the global supply chains from China to Southeast Asia. Therefore, it has helped boost foreign investments in some regional countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And of course, there was many limitations of the Trump administration's approach towards the region that are waiting to be rectified or reversed by Biden and his team. These include the heavily militarized focus of engagement led by the Department of Defense, rather than the State Department and American diplomats, the neglect of ASEAN and ASEAN-led multilateral democracy, the withdrawal from the multilateral trading system, and the obsession with the US trade deficit, as well as the anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, and anti-climate change action policy of the Trump administration. This checkered track record of the Trump administration in its engagement with Southeast Asia provides an important backdrop for the formulation of the Biden administration's Southeast Asia policy, if there is to be such a thing. And from the very early signs that I have gathered thus far, my preliminary view and hope is that Biden's policy towards the region will not be a wholesale denunciation of Trump's, but a dialectic of continuation and update of both realism and principle, and of course, hopefully with greater coherence, predictability, and coordination, both within the US political system and with its allies and partners. And with that, I would end my presentation here and look forward to questions and answers.
Okay, it's your turn now, Joseph, if you could take the mic.
Thanks, Don. I think Ha has done a fantastic job sort of laying the groundwork. So I really am wondering why you need me around. But nevertheless, let me just use 10, 12 minutes to reinforce and amplify some of the points that Ha raised from my own perspective and my own reading of how things appear to be taking shape with regards to the Biden administration's policies, possible policies towards Southeast Asia. Obviously, as Don mentioned at the beginning, we are about 3 months, more or less, in, which means to say that it is still a bit premature to determine very much from what has transpired so far. And on the other hand, it is always a tall order to try to sort of ascertain and present a Southeast Asian view on the US or on anything for that matter. Yeah, it's a very diverse region, and in terms of its outlooks, I think the very unfortunate situation in Myanmar just brings home the point about how difficult it is for Southeast Asia to sort of stake a common shared position on any given issue. In terms of the Biden administration's engagement with the US, just a bit of an empirical data point. I asked my my RA to do a count, and there have been thus far, I think, 18 interactions between Biden cabinet officials with Southeast Asian counterparts. Most of them were involving Anthony Blinken, with a few involving NSA Jake Sullivan, and for the most part, it has been with, I believe, Vietnamese, Singapore, Filipino officials, one with Malaysian. Now, let me get straight to the thoughts that I have. What I'll do is I'll share three sort of reasons for cautious optimism and three inconveniences with regards to what lies ahead. The first reason, the first issue that occasions some optimism, I think, is the question of US being a resident power in Asia. Now, why do I put that forward? Reason is because there has been quite a bit of talk about the US being back, right? With the Biden administration, everyone's saying that the US is back. Of course, Ha raised a very important point about continuity, and the question is, did the US really leave, so to speak, such that it has to come back? And in what areas are we talking about it being back? In regional trade, for example, I don't really see the US being back anytime soon. Yeah, and that is something that matters for the region. But nevertheless, the situation now, I think, occasions some hope that the notion that the US is a resident power in Asia is going to be reinforced. The Indo-Pacific concept, it's okay, I guess, depending on how we can unpack that in the discussion. But it doesn't take away from the fact that the US is a Pacific power. ASEAN itself remains ambivalent on the Indo-Pacific beyond it as a geographical concept. Even as a geographical concept, I think many regional states still use the term Asia-Pacific. They may even prefer the term Asia-Pacific. But nevertheless, with the Biden administration and the activity surrounding it, there is a sense that the United States is going to take the region more seriously and may be prepared to be proactive about it. Second, an obvious point, a return to a degree of predictability, a shift away from Twitter foreign policy, so to speak. I think this manifests in a number of ways, primarily in the sense that a lot of the officials that are in positions of decision-making influence today are familiar with the region, work closely with the region in the context of the Obama administration, which is significant because Obama did ramp up did attempt to ramp up its engagement with Southeast Asia. We can quibble about what actually materialized, but there is no denying the fact that there was a lot of diplomatic exchange going to and fro, which means that there were a lot of personal interactions, which means that these are very familiar people, to a degree perhaps that was not seen in the personal relationships with the previous administration officials. And in Southeast Asia, a region where the diplomatic culture places a lot of currency on personal interaction and familiarity with each other, I think we cannot overemphasize that point. Yeah, and Southeast Asian foreign policy establishments themselves do, as you know, invest quite heavily in trying to familiarize themselves with the decision-making process in the US. Not just in terms of individuals, but institutions as well and how they operate. So it was a bit of a curveball during the Trump administration, where decisions could take a sharp 180-degree turn, where Trump officials spent a lot of time trying to not just explain, but to to some degree even overturn the decisions announced by the chief executive. Yeah, so that's the second thing, return to predictability. The third thing is again, just to reinforce Ha's point about elements of continuity. A lot of people want to talk about how the Biden administration will be or has already been significant a departure from the Trump administration, and how the Trump administration was a departure from the Obama administration. But those of us who have watched American policy evolve over the years, over the last decade and a half, will be very keenly aware that there are more than a few threads of continuity. No doubt there's disruption, yeah, and I think the regional trade agenda, the Trump administration stepping back from globalization, where Southeast Asia is a region that very much embraces globalization. That one obviously sticks out. But at the same time, in terms of defense and security policies, we all know that there has been a very consistent tempo to it. In fact, it's gradually being ramped up. It was ramped up during the Trump administration. Biden is continuing that tempo as far as we can tell, and I don't hear of any Southeast Asian countries complaining about that. Yeah, the complaint that they usually articulate is that Southeast Asia prefers a more holistic American engagement strategy. Yeah, so not just predicated on defense, but also on trade and economics, infrastructure. That component is lacking. We need some action on that score. To be sure, but that doesn't take away from the importance of the defense engagement, which continues. So let me move very quickly to the three inconveniences. The first is multilateralism. Now, there's a very clear distinction between the Biden administration's approach to multilateralism and that of his predecessors. And on the surface, it is welcome, right? We welcome a more multilaterally engaged United States in general. But there is, I think, a consequential caveat to this as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, and it relates to China, obviously. Now, the Trump administration was very prepared to push back on China unilaterally. Yeah, to some extent, the Quad was designed to do that, but essentially unilateral. The Biden administration has made it very clear that it wants to, and he didn't use this term, and I borrow it from the Bush 43 administration, coalitions of the willing. Yeah, in other words, a more collective effort by like-minded states that share the same reservations about the geopolitical, geostrategic circumstances, working together to sort of take a stand. Now, ASEAN is going to be very, very careful in how it responds to this call for any sort of a unified position to push back on China. Yeah, in fact, I won't even say very careful. ASEAN will not want to be part of it. And the Southeast Asian states, for the most part, also will be very hesitant to be part of it. So that's the first inconvenience. The second is the question of values. There appears to be a return of emphasis to value-based diplomacy and foreign policy, you know, the whole democratization and human rights agenda. And it's quite clear that Biden is going to fly those standards very high in the air, or desires to do so, with his conference on democracies that he wants to put together. Of course, we take a step back, we realize that this is really it's entrenched in the American DNA. It's not something new. It's not something unique to the Biden administration. Even during the Trump administration, whatever the president says, I think as far as his his officials were concerned, they were more or less, to some degree or other, informed by these values as well. So it's in character and in the nature of American foreign policy, and it's always been managed between American partners and allies and the US. But obviously, there is a divergence between American value-based foreign policy and what Asian societies feel about those values, and more precisely, the exercise of those values. Yeah, we can go back and talk about the Asian values debate and all that sort of stuff, but the main point is that I don't think that many Southeast Asian states share the American view about how definitive and how universal those values are. And we can, of course, again, have a discussion on the authenticity of such debates. The third and final point is really related to bandwidth, and by which I mean bandwidth for the United States. Okay, I think there's no gainsaying that the Biden administration is bedeviled with a whole host of domestic challenges, and he may be a president who is personally far more inclined towards foreign policy and traveling the world as some of his other predecessors. But the reality is that his priority, his paramount priority, is fixing some of these domestic problems, yeah, which he obviously is not going to be able to do within 4 years. No president will be able to pull it off within 4 years. The question is how to prevent it from getting worse, in fact. I think that is going to take away a lot of the time, energy, and resources that American friends and allies would wish and would desire that it could be spent on them and helping them in their part of the world. But the reality is the United States is, at the end of the day, very much like any other country, that it has to prioritize its domestic needs and domestic situation. And at this point in history, given the polarization, given the pandemic and the economic consequences of that, the United States is trying to navigate much rougher domestic waters than it has had to in a while. So I will end with that point and welcome the discussion and the debate.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And I like the complementarity between the two presentations. We have Ha on the kind of statistical basis of an understanding of what, at least admittedly, a non-random sample of Southeast Asian elites think about our topic. And then at the same time, we have Joseph pointing out inconveniences, caveats, and taking perhaps a somewhat more realistic view than one might infer from the survey about the future of US relations with Southeast Asia. And perhaps that's where I could begin to kick off the conversation between us before we open it to Q&A. I can well imagine that Americans who may be watching this program and who may not have realized the way in which, to put it very crudely and generally, the popularity of the United States and compared to China has improved rather dramatically over the period of time, the 3 years in which the survey has been exercised. And it's important to keep in mind that the survey, after all, was performed at the end of 2020, toward the end of 2020. And perhaps, Ha, that would mean that the optimism about the future with regard to the US and the positive reviews of the US, knowing that the how should we describe it? Let's just say the Trump era was coming to a close, that might in retrospect be sort of peak approval. Is it possible that this relative confidence that the US will do the right thing and so forth will fade as reality sets in? So that's, I guess, a question to begin with.
to some extent, I think this kind of optimism can be sustained because it is. We very much believe that with the Biden administration, there will be the return of predictability, as Prof. Liow mentioned, the return of diplomacy and decency. So, we would not be like subject to and exposed to all kinds of like tweets and all of this chaotic, messy communications in terms of the U.S. Foreign policy in general, the U.S. Domestic politics, domestic governance, as well as U.S. engagement with the region. So I very much hope that this kind of general optimism can hold. And the preliminary signs of the U.S. Of the Biden administration approach of foreign policy in general, as well as towards China, which is a very critical partner in this region. It shows that there is maturity and stability, which we in this part of the world highly regard and treasure, because only on predictability and stability can we, formulate longer term engagement. Thanks.
And then if I could for you, Joseph, and I would encourage any interaction between the two of you. If one of you would like to comment on what the other has said, please interrupt me and feel free to do that. And this involves a question from my colleague, Tom Finger, who writes, why should Southeast Asia's problems with China be seen as American problems rather than Southeast Asian problems? Quite a challenging question. And I could I could add my own views on that, but I won't. Joseph, how would you respond to that question? Why should Southeast Asian problems with China be seen as American problems?
You could just as easily turn that question around. Why should America's problems with China be seen as Southeast Asian problems?
Yes, right? Exactly.
But okay, let me respond to the question, beginning by sort of adding on to some of the points that Ha raised earlier in response to the first question. Yeah, in the spirit of interaction. Right. I think there are two other reasons that explain the findings, and in particular what you pointed out, Don, the apparent peak towards the end of the Trump administration. The first is that, and this I find ironic, because on the one hand, Southeast Asia, we always tell the United States that try not to view the region through China lenses. Try to sort of view us and value us for what we are, for who we are, right? But on the other hand, the reality is many Southeast Asians, especially decision makers, we ourselves, we triangulate in our mind. When we think about the US, we cast one eye towards Beijing. And when we think about China, we cast one eye towards Washington. We do that. It's just how it is when you grow up figuratively, so to speak, as a region that has to handle all these external powers. It almost comes naturally, right? So in other words, there is some degree of correlation between the popularity of the United States and possibly missteps on the part of China, which leads me to my second point, that there have been missteps by the Chinese. So how else can you explain the very glaring anomaly between the important economic role of China and the reservations and the reticence that the region has towards it? China still, in its efforts to, let me put this way, in its effort to adjust to great power status, it still has this tendency to overplay its hand in a very sort of emotive way. Point number one. Point number two, I think that in terms of the thing that is closest, literally closest to Southeast Asia's heart, the South China Sea. Yeah, that is an area where it's a cacophony, I think, in China as far as internal discussions on South China Sea policy is concerned. We seem to sometimes we get into the trap of thinking that there is a China policy on the South China Sea. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. But more specifically now to the question of why Southeast Asian problems, why should Southeast Asia's problems with China be seen as American problems? I think that gets to the age-old issue of Southeast Asia wanting and very much positioning itself as a region where external powers are all invested and have a stake in the stability of the region. It's quite interesting, Tom. Don, you remember back in the day there was Zoc Fan, right?
Right.
And Zoc Fan came out of initially the Malaysian 1968, I believe, suggestion of the neutralization of Southeast Asia.
Right.
And back then,
just to remind our audience, Zoc Fan stands for the Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, ZOPFAN.
Yeah. And back then, when the region was having those discussions, the main point was how to keep external powers out of the region. Yeah, don't come in, don't butt in, stay out. We've gone 180 degrees, so the position now is, so long as external powers are prepared to contribute constructively to the region, it must be in their interest, and Southeast Asia must endeavor to make it their interest to be invested in the region.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what they've done. And so as a result, when there are potential issues with regards to one member, one power that is involved in the region, to us it is an issue that has to be dealt with by all the parties that have a stake in the region, right? So again, on the South China Sea, we're very much the Chinese are adamant that we should not internationalize the issue, but if it's international trade that flows through international waterways, what's there to quibble about internationalizing the issue? Yeah.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, on the 24th, 4 days from now, and I could be mistaken, perhaps that date has been changed already, there is an intention to convene a meeting, an ASEAN meeting, to discuss Myanmar. And so my question to you is this: to what extent, this gets us a little bit off the topic of what Southeast Asians now think of the United States, but what they will think of the United States, more positive, less positive, if the United States continues to sanction the junta in Myanmar based on a commitment to the value of democracy, while ASEAN, in a sense, anoints, that's too harsh, but legitimates the junta by inviting it to sit at the table with the other members of ASEAN. ASEAN has already been called a club of dictators, but it has not yet, to my knowledge, been called a club that harbors a murderer, right? Which is exactly what Min Aung Hlaing is in Myanmar. To what extent do you think that kind of scenario could create significant differences between some governments in Southeast Asia on the one hand and the Biden administration on the other hand, so that this honeymoon period that shows up perhaps in the survey is ended? Would either one of you want to comment about that?
Okay, let me share some thoughts on that, Don. I was expecting such a easy question from you. I'm not here to defend ASEAN, but let me say a few things. The first is that so everyone, or not everyone, a lot of people are appalled at the fact that ASEAN is going to meet with Min Aung Hlaing, right? There is an assumption here, and I think it's premature to assume this. And the assumption is that when they meet, it's going to be a kumbaya kind of meeting.
Mm-hmm.
It could well be a bloody tough meeting for Min Aung Hlaing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't know, but it could be. His back could be against the wall at that meeting. That's the first thing. The second thing is the meeting was. ASEAN decided to have this meeting because they needed to both hear but also convey their views in person to Min Aung Hlaing, right? And we don't know the structure of the meeting at this point in time, whether it's a 9+1 or it's ASEAN 9 meeting the representative of the leader of the junta. I think for ASEAN in the ASEAN context, these kinds of optics are very, very important. Yeah. Remember the last meeting, ASEAN made it very clear that it was 9 ASEAN ministers and a representative of the junta, not the Myanmar government. Yeah. Number 3, there has been a very vocal push by members of the new unity government to obviously asking ASEAN to rescind that invitation to Min Aung Hlaing, but also desiring to have a meeting with ASEAN. Now, we can't dismiss the possibility that ASEAN or even some members of ASEAN might meet with the NUG, right? So that is a possibility as well. And as to the point on sanctions, I think there the picture is a bit clearer for now, because ASEAN's position at this point is still that sanctions is probably not going to get the intended outcomes that the people who are sanctioning hope to achieve. I think the present currently the sense is that the United States has very adroitly calibrated sanctions, and but even then, if the situation persists, I think from the US perspective, it will be more and more difficult. And in any case, the reality in Myanmar is there any way to sort of restrict and isolate your sanctions on the junta and individuals in the junta without it having an effect on the people of Myanmar by way of affecting the Myanmar economy? I mean, the reality is the junta has its hands in everything, right? From real estate to telecommunications to food stalls in the market, right? So yeah, going ahead, it will be those degrees of complications.
Yeah.
Now the interesting thing is this: the members of the the Biden administration cabinet, the foreign policy establishment, they are very sensitive of that fine line between the sort of political, the strategic issues involved with regards to policy towards Myanmar now, and the kind of pressure, value-based pressures that they will face. But there's another actor here, and that is the US Congress. And we do know that historically, to the extent that there was one issue that American Congresses of the past really bothered about Southeast Asia post-Vietnam, was Myanmar.
Yes.
Right? Was Myanmar, resolution after resolution. So the question now is whether we are going to return to that situation, and that will create additional problems for the foreign policy establishment in Washington in terms of how they would prefer to calibrate their policy and their response to Myanmar.
Yeah. Yep. Here's a question from one of the attendees, Perry Bloom. Chinese President Xi increasingly articulates China's domestic and international goals in ethno-national language. How do ASEAN nations think the US should respond to Chinese objectives such as Tian Sha, all under heaven?
Yeah, the notion of Tianxia and all under the heaven, right, it evokes the imperial past of China as well as the so-called tributary relations between the dynastic China and its neighbor countries. And of course, it is diametrically different from the Westphalian interstate system in this modern time. However, I think China, through its kind of like proposition of community of common destiny among ASEAN and among Southeast Asian countries and China, has tried to resurrect a certain kind of like a hierarchical order in the region, which is not like, of course, it is not legally a legal thing, but it is a real, is a reality of the power asymmetry among between ASEAN, between China and Southeast Asian countries. So on the one hand, we realize that there is this kind of ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries have to accommodate and respect China by its own because of it, by virtue of its might and its size. But at the same time, Southeast Asian countries are very much immersed in the Westphalian state system. And of course, having the region open and inclusive with all other major powers, especially the US, invested and engaged in the region is a way to dilute that kind of gravity towards China and to make sure that the hierarchical order is not like the determinant factor in the region relationship with China in China.
Here is another somewhat discomforting question, which for that very reason I think is worth asking. In the spirit of the survey, if forced to choose between China and Southeast Asia, which do you think Americans would choose?
Well, I think we have the historical precedents, maybe not by choosing the whole of Southeast Asia, and the choice between the whole of Southeast Asia and China, but the choice of between some individual Southeast Asian countries and China. So China's proposition of the G2, the condo between the US and China and the Pacific or the Indo-Pacific is big enough for the two great powers. So the two separate spheres of influence evokes that kind of binary choice. But I don't think the US as a whole can afford to make a choice between Southeast Asia as a whole and China because of the diversity among Southeast Asian countries. But historically, as a Vietnamese, I know that the US has made the choice over China, of China over Vietnam in the past.
I will be more blunt. And in this parallel universe, if the US had to do this survey, I think it's patently obvious that they will choose Southeast Asia. And the reason why is because American society has been psyched up to see China as the enemy on every count, whether it's trade, whether it's technology, textiles, sports, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think China's behavior, at least as it is interpreted here in the United States, in a fairly substantial consensus that China is a rival, a problem. Yes, you're right. But which would be the rational choice? I mean, if Ha is correct, and she is correct, in thinking that Southeast Asia is extremely diverse, that in some sense, Southeast Asia only exists as a rubric, a category, right? I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious here. Obviously, it's more than that. There's an organization, there's a history dating back to 1967 and so forth. Nevertheless, the sheer diversity of Southeast Asia, it seems to me, reduces the choice in Southeast Asia, not to ASEAN for all its diversity, but rather to particular countries. For example, should the United States choose Indonesia, let's say, over China, before we end the exercise, because we do have a cushion, is there anything that the two of you would like to say back and forth in terms of responding? You know, we had, in a sense, we had the quantitative evidence, if I can put it that way, from Ha, and we had a different, more qualitative perspective, if I can use that phrase, from you. The two, I think, go together. But are there any unresolved tensions or differences or alternatives between the two?
I'll just make one observation, one point which I've made on other platforms before about the survey. I think no matter how good a survey is, not this one in particular, it can never capture the full the entire sort of gamut of issues and opinions. So in that respect, and specifically with regards to China, I've always been wondering that if a similar survey was done, but limited exclusively to the commercial sector, what kind of bars and tables, or rather how those bars and tables will look. Obviously my totally unscientific hunch is that it would look quite different. It would look quite different. But as ISEAS has pointed out every time in the preface, that this survey it's a specific not audience, a specific pool of people that they go to for the interviews, the sample size.
How would you respond? That's, I think, a very interesting point.
I wish to further amplify and emphasize the points that were just raised by Prof. Liow. Actually, it is my consistent concern with regard to the survey. One is that, as I qualified in the introduction, it is our targeted audience is mainly the foreign policy circle, not the commercial sector. And I have attended a few events that involve the businessmen when it comes to trade and business with China. And of course, the anticipation towards the economic opportunities that China can offer, and Chinese soft power in that sense is very, very strong. And there may be a kind of like dichotomy between the foreign policy, strategic security establishment, and the business sector. And also, I also have a related concern with regard to the risk of group thinking. Actually, because every year we reach out to, the same targeted audience, like as far as I know, for the Vietnamese audience, those are the people that I have reached out year in and year out. And I have asked them to reach out to other contacts of theirs. But I believe that, there is this kind of the risk of echo chambers and groupthink that we have to be aware of. So moving forward, I very much hope that we can reach out to a larger portion of the audience and stakeholders in Southeast Asia with regard to these issues, because engagement between the U.S., between Southeast Asia and the U.S. and with China is very holistic and comprehensive, and it's not purely security strategic centric.
Yeah, right. And I think if we can end on that note and perhaps turn it a little bit into a policy note, if I'm not being presumptuous, the inference I take away from what you and Joseph have just said is that the priority for the Biden administration, quite apart from security and democracy and strategy and so forth, geopolitical issues, the challenge for the Biden administration will be what can they do on the economy, on the economic side, that possibly from the standpoint of Southeast Asians, security matters more than democracy. And security means personal security, which means putting food on the table and having a job. Economic dimensions that perhaps China is attending to more assiduously than is the United States. So on that somewhat self-critical note, thank you so much, both of you. It was a fascinating conversation. I enjoyed it greatly. I hope I didn't intervene too much. Thank you both very much.